welcome again to chesslecture.com. This is International Master David Vigorito. Today we're going to be tackling a kind of broad subject. We're going to be discussing, by request, some ideas in choosing your openings and studying your openings. So it's just going to kind of be a general guide. This kind of thing has probably been covered a little bit before, but everyone kind of has a different take on this, so I'm going to give you mine today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the style of openings that you play. And what I mean by this is you have to kind of know if you're a very solid player or a very sharp player in choosing your openings. For example, first we're going to discuss black. So against e4, if you want to play sharply, then your best choices, of course, are going to be the Sicilian and maybe something like the Perk, fianchetto opening, which these openings are more risky but give better winning chances. Now, if you're a solid player and you don't like to mix it up, you're probably going to either look at something like e5 or the Caro-Can, c6, or even the French. One good thing about the French from a practical point of view is there's only really 3 lines you have to know, because after d4, d5, white can play e5 or knight d2 or knight c3. And you also have to know some things like when white does not play d4 in the exchange variation, but those are very easy to learn. So in some sense, the French is a very practical opening if you want to play something that's solid but has some dynamic chances. Against d4, the choice can be a little more difficult because the sharper openings are a little more risky in some ways. Most of the sharp openings are dark square openings. So after d4, knight f6, your sharp choices are going to be the King's Indian, allowing white to play e4, or the Grunfeld, also a very sharp opening, or the Banco Gambit, or the modern Benoni. Now, if you're going to play solidly against d4, you can still play an Indian defense, and you can play the Nimzo, which is very popular. You could play the Queen's Indian or the Bogo Indian when white does knight f3, which I've discussed a few times here, these openings. Or you can play a different kind of classical opening by playing d4, d5. And here you have a lot of good choices. You can play the Queen's Gambit accepted, you can play the Slav, you can play the Queen's Gambit declined. All very solid. This would match well with playing either e4, e5, or the Caro or the French, and we'll discuss that too. But one reason the Nimzo Indian is so popular is that it's a little sharper than something like the Queen's Gambit declined or Slav, but it's not quite so risky as the dark square defenses. So really the first thing you need to do is decide how you want to play with black. If you want to play trying to equalize with a classical defense or a solid defense. When I say classical defense, I'll mean d4, d5, and e4, e5. And the solid defenses will be something like the Nimzo, the Slav, and against e4, the solid openings would be the Caro and the French, as well as e5, which would be the classical opening. And most of the sharp openings are dark square defenses, whether it's the Perk or some kind of Sicilian or some kind of dark squared Indian defense. So that's the first kind of decision you have to make. Now, another thing you have to consider is how many openings you want to play. For example, against e4, are you going to play several kinds of Sicilians? Or, a lot of people play many different openings, and this can be good or bad. A lot of it depends on how much work you're willing to do, how good a memory you have. If you don't have a lot of time to study and you're not blessed with a phenomenal memory, and you're like a club player, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to kind of play a different opening all the time. You might think you're surprising your opponents by playing the Knight or Sicilian one day, and the Caro the next, and the Petrov the day after that. But the surprise value is probably less important than actually knowing your openings. Now, one thing I would suggest is having your black openings match a little bit. And what I mean by that is if you like to play the caro can, then a good defense to d4 would be like a sister opening to that, which would be the Slav, because many of the ideas are the same. You have a foothold in the center, you're playing on the light squares, and it also lets you address some kind of move order things like knight f3 or c4. You can play c4, c6, and now, of course, d4, d5 is a Slav, and if white plays e4, d5, we can actually transpose to the Panov attack of the caro. Transpositions are very important too, something I've discussed here. Like if we look at this position, we'll see, even though it arose from the English opening, it's really the same as this position, just by a different move order. So if you want to play solidly, something like the caro and Slav is a good choice. Another way of doing this is to say play the French and play some kind of light square defense against d4, either the Nimzo or even the Queen's Gambit declined. The openings aren't exactly the same, but there's similar themes, playing on the light squares, playing solidly. Doing something like this also gives you the option of doing d4, e6 if you want to avoid something like the Trompowsky, because now e4, d5, and if c4, you can either play d5 or knight f6. So it gives you some flexibility. Now, another thing to consider here is whether or not to play main lines or kind of offbeat openings. And generally, I suggest that you play the main lines. And there's a couple reasons for that. Generally, the main lines are the main lines for a reason, because they've been tested. And also, by playing main lines, you're more likely to better develop your chess. For example, against e4, say you like sharp play. Now, of course, you can play something like the Sicilian, or you could play something like the Latvian, something sharp. And we get a lot of requests for kind of some of these offbeat openings, and I'm always very hesitant to tackle them because I really don't believe in them. I think the Latvian is probably quite a bad opening, where black is very likely to end up worse. The other problem with this, too, is something to consider is what your chess ambitions are. If you're really going to try to just get better and better, or if you like to just kind of play around and play sharply and, you know, kind of have a coffee house style. I imagine if you're getting chesslecture.com, you probably take your chess at least a little bit seriously and want to improve as a player. And I think playing an opening like the Latvian is kind of the wrong way to do that. Let's say you play the Latvian Gambit and you become a stronger and stronger player. For example, let's say you're a 1500 player and you're just getting better and better. You're developing your tactics playing the Latvian, which it can certainly do. You know, it's not without its few pluses. But eventually you're going to get good enough that you're playing players that will be ready for the Latvian, and they'll come well prepared. And because the opening is objectively dubious, eventually you're going to run into trouble because the white player will be prepared and you're going to get a bad position. Now, if you like to play sharply and you had taken a different approach and not played f5, even if you play something like the Marshal, there's a few different ways you can play sharply here, whether it be something like the open Spanish, which can be very sharp, which goes like this. It's not quite as coffee house as the Latvian, but you can still get sharp positions. There's a lot of sharp lines. Now, if you had started studying an opening like this, and you become a stronger and stronger player, you don't have to throw this line out of your repertoire. You can keep kind of fine-tuning it. You can also switch between lines. For example, after c3, there's a few different lines. Like you can play bishop c5, or you can play bishop e7. You know, there's a couple different ways to play. You know, playing a main line like the Spanish gives you the opportunity to learn about chess and to very easily switch between lines. If you've been playing nothing but the Latvian, you really have nowhere to go. You might be prepared against like knight c3 or bishop c4, but after knight f3, if you've always counted on f5 instead of like knight c6, you're really going to have to start learning an opening from scratch. Whereas if you played a main line, that's not the case. Now this is also true in the case of a solid opening. If you play something like the main line of the Spanish with black, like the Chigorin defense, which goes like this. This is a very old main line of the Ruy Lopez. And the thing about playing an opening like this is if some line develops problems or you just get bored, there's many ways to play this. For example, in this position after 12 knight bd2, you can play rook to d8, you can play c takes d4, you can play bishop to b7. There's many different lines here. So you can still, your openings don't have to get stodgy playing the same thing every time, but you'll have a much better basis for your openings. Now, this is also true versus d4. Say you play something like the Budapest, which a lot of people think is like this really sharp, tricky opening, but that's not really the case, unless white makes a mistake. Usually this opening ends up being fairly positional, with white usually getting a little edge. And this is an opening I'm always happy to play against, because you can play safely with white, and you'll get a little edge, instead of just trying to refute the opening. But if you play this way with black, eventually you'll probably give it up. Also, this opening only works against this one move order. If white plays knight f3 here, you already need a second opening. But if you play something like the Budapest, probably eventually you'll discard it, and you'll have to start playing something else, again, from scratch. This is also true in some d4, d5 openings. There's something like the Chigorin is actually quite playable and kind of sharp. It's just a little riskier. But there's some other openings like the Albin or the so-called Baltic defense with bishop f5 that are maybe interesting and fun, but probably are not going to hold up long term. So with the main lines, you don't have to play the most critical line all the time. You don't have to follow the 2700s, who are for the most part only playing a handful of boring openings now, like the Petrov and the Queen's Indian. But there's kind of an in-between too. Now, another suggestion against e4 is if you play the Sicilian, it seems like there's so much to learn in the Sicilian, but a good learning opening, if you want to play sharply, is actually the Dragon, which maybe if you're a grandmaster, it might not always hold up so well, but the Dragon's a very good opening, I think, for many reasons. Of course, there's many anti-Sicilians that white can play, but you can always watch my half-dozen lectures that will take care of that. But the thing about the Dragon, which I used to play all the time, and I think it helped me develop my chess, is that there's a lot of different themes, both positionally, materially. For example, in the classical Dragon, there's a lot of ideas that help you develop your pieces properly. There's very common ideas like rook c8, takes c3, and knight e4. So it kind of helps you learn the value of the pieces and of like an exchange sacrifice. And in the main lines, this is true too. If white plays the Yugoslav attack, like the sharpest lines, you can learn a lot about the initiative and opposite castling. It can help teach you not to be too materialistic. Again, there's also a lot of exchange sacks on c3. I'm not going to get into the theory here, but this is an opening that maybe at the highest levels might be some flaws from a theoretical perspective, but there's still a lot to be learned playing an opening like this. And if you play something like this is actually kind of how I developed. I played the Dragon, and then I moved on to the Najdorf, which is a little more respectable at a high level. But the time I spent on the Dragon was not wasted for a couple of reasons. One, I had already covered all the stuff here after e4, c5, like the c3 Sicilian, like the close Sicilian, the Grand Prix attack, etc., which I've done lectures on. Also, like the bishop e5 Sicilian, I had already covered. So all I really had to do was learn like this position, which I'm not saying it's not a lot, but my experience in the dragon proved useful in the Najdorf. There's also some lines, like if they do A4, where you might transpose to a dragon, which is pretty respectable. The dragon was also useful in certain sneaky move orders for white. For example, knight c3, like knight c6, knight e2, g6, d4, cd, knight d4, and you can reach a dragon position this way, which is really an accelerated dragon where white has not played the Maratsi bind with c4, so that's some achievement. So this has helped me because I can play knight c6 on move 2 against knight c3. Now, addressing the sister openings again, if you like sharp openings, like the Sicilian, whether it be the dragon, the Sveshnikov, the Najdorf, or if you like to play an opening like the Perk with the fianchetto, against d4 you can play in a similar vein. You can play the King's Indian or the Grunfeld, which I think kind of match well if you play the Perk or even a Sicilian. There's not really a mirror image to the Sicilian other than the Dutch, which is an interesting opening, but it can be hard to get the position you want after d4, f5. White has some good anti-Dutch moves, unlike the Sicilian, where something like the closed Sicilian isn't terribly dangerous theoretically, and the Dutch moves like knight c3 are probably just as good as the main lines, knight c3 and maybe even bishop g5. So now we are going to discuss some white openings. Now with white, we're going to have a similar kind of issue about whether to play sharp opening or solid opening. Now, of course, e4 is generally considered the sharpest way to open, but this isn't always the case. Like, you can play something like the closed Sicilian, which isn't terribly theoretical or sharp, although it can reach sharp positions. And if you play d4, you can play something kind of dry, like, you know, the London system or something. Or you can also play the sharpest lines with d4. Now, one reason that I play d4 is kind of really a practical issue. I like to play kind of more principled lines, and with e4, it's an awful lot to have to study to compete playing stuff like the open Sicilian. There's just tons of theory. Also, the Spanish is a ton to deal with. So I realized once that I think if you play something like the Ray Lopez main lines and the the Sicilian main lines, it's really just about as much as playing all of d4. So a lot of times if you play e4, you have to kind of fall back on secondary lines, which isn't necessarily bad. And what I mean by that is, against e4, e5, there's some choices like the exchange Spanish, which can be pretty dangerous. You can play some slower lines of the Spanish, you know, maybe lines with like d3 or something. Or you can play something like bishop c4 and play like a slow gioco piano, like with d3 and c3 and bishop b3. This is a way of just kind of getting a position. You probably won't get, you know, a huge advantage, but it's very practical. And then there's an opening like the Scotch, which I've covered for black, which I think is kind of a sensible opening to play as white as well, just because it does have some venom, and it's a lot less to learn than the Spanish, where black has about 10 main lines that you have to be ready for. Now, the Sicilian, we have some of the same issues. The open Sicilian can be quite a bit of work if you're going to play the main lines, whether it be bishop e3 or bishop g5 against the Najdorf. There's a lot to know. You know, I've covered stuff like the English attack for black here, but let me mention too that when I cover this with black, I really only have to cover one line, but there's probably about 4 or 5 major ways to play this with black. So with white, you have to be prepared for all of them, not to mention after bishop e3, you have to be prepared for e6 and for knight g4. So you see a lot of top grandmasters playing this way, but they're professional chess players. You know, I probably wouldn't play bishop e3 unless I had a lot of time to work on it. The same can hold true for bishop g5, where black has about 6 major defenses, and all of them are doing pretty well theoretically. So in some ways this isn't so practical. Now another way to play the Sicilian with white is to just play, is you can play the open Sicilians, but just kind of play classically like bishop e2, like Karpov used to do against most of the major lines. Play bishop e2 against the dragon, against the knight, or that's one way of playing. It's not the sharpest, but you will get sharp positions. And another approach, of course, is to not play the open Sicilian and to play something like the closed Sicilian for white, which isn't going to scare too many black players, but if you're playing the closed Sicilian with white, you're probably going to get it in about 30% of your game, so you'll have a lot of experience. So it's very reasonable to play this way with white. Even though you're not going to scare anybody, you're going to get positions that you know and that you're comfortable with. A sharper way of playing is the c3 Sicilian, which oftentimes does end up pretty sharp. Of course, I've covered this line with black, where I, had knight f6. But with white, you have to know a few lines. You have to know knight f6, which can lead to several different lines, but there's also d5 is the other main line, and then there's some other lines like g6 and e6. Now, the c3 Sicilian can be good if you play other openings. It matches well with a couple of things. For example, if you like to play the advanced French, the c3 Sicilian goes pretty well with that, because after e6, d4, d5, you can play e5. I think that the c3 Sicilian goes well with something like the Panov attack and the Caro-Can. And the Panov, we usually get an isolated pawn with white, after a dc at some point. And the c3 Sicilian, we oftentimes get an isolated pawn. Isolated pawn isn't for everybody, but a lot of players like to play this way with white. They're more concerned with piece activity than pawn structure. So these openings kind of link up well. And against the French, of course, we have a few choices. The sharpest line is going to be knight c3. The advance is very practical because there's less to learn. Knight c3, you have to be ready for the winnower, which is sharp, and the classical, which is sharp. And of course, you can play knight d2, which Jesse once told me that he thought that the exchange variation was probably better than the Tarrasch, which I kind of understand. The Tarrasch French, black has several different lines, like knight f6, c5, knight c6 is interesting, and this move bishop e7 kind of becoming popular really showed how harmless the Tarrasch can be. Theoretically, I think black is doing pretty well in almost every line against the Tarrasch. That's why you don't see it so much at a high level. And there's a lot of lines to learn as white. So knight c3 would be my suggestion if you want to play sharply, and if you want to play strategically, play e5. So e4 is, of course, the most natural move in some sense, but there can be a lot to learn if you play the sharpest lines. But there's ways of trimming that down and still getting an interesting game. Now d4, on the other hand, you have a very wide choice. I like playing d4 because almost everything I find interesting. And also, the game tends to not be decided so quickly in the opening, so you're less likely to have such a serious theoretical battle as you would in, say, a knight or Sicilian. And again, here we can play very solidly with like knight f3 and bishop f4, which I don't think will help develop your chess so much, playing the exact same position like every game. Whereas if you play c4, you're much more likely to get an interesting game. Now, there's also some ways of playing with gambits here, which I kind of mentioned with black with the Latvian, with something like the Black-Mardamer gambit. And to me, this is just the wrong way to play chess and to try to develop, playing a gambit like this. Even if black accepts the gambit, you might learn how to attack, but that's about all you'll learn. And there's a lot more to chess than playing, bishop c4 and castles and trying to attack f7. You're only going to go so far learning how to do one thing and getting the same position every game. And if you play d4, there's other ways of playing sharply. So in general, I would stay away from these kind of junky openings. They're really just shortcuts. And you'll see certain, books or, websites, whatever, that will suggest playing this way, but really in the long run, it's going to hinder your development. Now, another suggestion I'll make is in choosing a repertoire, because you have to know so much as white. I think in some ways it's it's easier to play black because you really just have to have a main defense against e4 and d4. And another way of playing is, when I discussed playing a lot of different openings, ideally you'd like to have a couple openings. For example, against e4, maybe, when you want to play sharply, you can play the Sicilian, and when you want to play solidly, you can play e5 or c6. It's very useful to have both, just because there'll always be some situation, maybe you've played the same opponent before, maybe it's a must-win game. A lot of times there's reasons that you want to switch things up, and if you only play the Caro, you have a must-win game, you might want to play something sharper. And if you want to play solidly against some certain player, you might want to play c5. A lot of times the opponent will have something to do with it. There's one approach saying just play the board, but if you're playing some crazy attacker, maybe you'd rather play e5 or c6 or e6, kind of have them bang their head against the wall. And with d4, it's just kind of the same thing. You can play, sharp Indian defense, but it can also be useful to have a classic defense. I always played sharp openings, and then a few years ago I started playing classically. I can play d4, d5, and I actually think that this can help your development a lot. There's a Russian trainer, Shereshevsky, and he used to have his students play both the Nimzo Indian and the King's Indian, and he said he noticed an interesting phenomenon, is that when he had his King's Indian players start playing the Nimzo, when they went back to playing the King's Indian, they tended to play it much better. And I actually understand this, and I think there's a reason for this. I think if you play, only openings like the Dragon and the King's Indian or the Grunfeld, you're just always looking to attack. Whereas when you play classically, you learn some kind of more basic elements. Like it's very back to basics. You're learning about, develop your pieces, have a good pawn structure, this and that. And I think that when you go back and play the sharp openings, you're able to incorporate some of these classical elements into your style to help you be a more rounded player. Now, something else to consider in developing your opening repertoire, if it's all a lot to fathom, when you're trying to pick out your black openings and especially your white openings, because when you play black, you have your main defense e4 and d4, but when you play white, if you play d4, you have a handful of Indian defenses to deal with and a handful of classical defenses to deal with. If you play e4, there's e5 and c5, which are a lot. There's the French, the Caro, and then the kind of secondary openings like the Scandinavian and the Alekhins. So one thing I would suggest is finding a player who you like, a top player, grandmaster or whatever, and look at their opening repertoires. And a lot of times you can model your play after them. There's a couple grandmasters in the U.S. that play e4, but they don't play like the main lines in the Sicilian. They might play g3 in a lot of Sicilians. They might play bishop e2 in some Sicilians. So if you find a player like that whose games you like, study a lot of their games in both black and white. And I think that's a very good way to study openings. If you say you wanted to learn the the Berlin and the Spanish for black, which is pretty boring, but of course you would look at like the games of Kramnik or Alexandrov or something, because there's some grandmasters just play the same openings all the time. The Queen's Indian, you could also look at like Kramnik or something, or Anand. But this is a very good way to study your openings. So my advice in general is really consider your style and what kind of positions you like, and try to pick openings that follow that. Definitely consider move orders and transpositions. There's some openings, especially in the closed openings, that are kind of move order proof. Like if you play the King's Indian or the Slav, Slav, you're always going to play c6 and d5. The King's Indian, you're always going to play knight f6 and g6. The Nimzo is a little trickier, and I've covered that in a few other lectures. Move order suggestions against c4, knight f3 for Nimzo players. Learn some classical lines if you have time and want to develop, even if you're a sharp player, and try to emulate some of the better players. So that concludes my lecture on kind of a general opening lecture. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write to us, and we will cover them. So thanks again for joining ChessLecture.com.